Okay, well, welcome everyone. Hopefully that is now all showing. If anyone is clever with Zoom at home and you know how to give a thumbs up that drifts over the screen and shows me that you're seeing things and hearing things correctly, that would be great. So, no thumbs up? Not maybe. Anyway, I suppose I should introduce tonight's speaker. We've got a chat there, so maybe that's working. I've known tonight's speaker for a long time, and I suspect that I could tell a few stories about him that he'd rather not share publicly. But he's asked me to keep this short and sweet, so I'll just stick with the core details, which is that Colin joined Ornithological Society, as it was then known, as a schoolboy, way too long ago. And worked for Department of Conservation about 19 years before joining the staff here at Te Papa 14 years ago with responsibilities for birds and reptiles. And somehow he managed to convince his wife and his manager, probably in that order, that he should disappear off for 4 months or so over this past summer, counting all the birds between Cape Reinga and Bluff. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he found, so I hope we might too. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to tonight's speaker, which is Colin Miskelly. So, yeah, Te Araroa, I'm going to start this, I hope. No, I'm not, because it's not working. So that's working. Now it is. Okay, I'm going to start with a rather unlikely slide for Te Araroa, which is Rakiura, Stewart Island, which is not part of Te Araroa. Some people who do the trail north to south then hop on a ferry and continue on and do go to Rakiura. But this is really where the idea of counting all the birds of Te Araroa had its genesis. So this is 2 summers previous. I had arranged a 3-week tramping trip down on Rakiura, starting with, I'll just get this to work. Now, so a little red laser hopefully working. So 3 of us walked around the Northwest Circuit, which takes about 8 or 9 days. That was with my brother Gordon and my sister-in-law Denise. And then 7 of us did the Great Walk, which is a 3-day small part of Rakiura. And then I stayed on for another week by myself and did the Southern Circuit down to Doughboy Bay. And during these 3 weeks, or maybe slightly after, I sort of realised a few things. The first was that the method that I'd developed for counting birds continuously in the hills around Wellington could be applied day after day, which didn't surprise me too much. It was more whether my powers of concentration would continue day after day rather than my mind drifting and doing other things other than counting birds that I was seeing or hearing. But the next one was that I discovered on the Northwest Circuit that my brother Gordon was also half interested in doing Te Araroa. And I must admit that up to that point, I'd really just been thinking about doing the backcountry bits and skipping the front country. But realising that you can count all the birds continuously, I thought that would make the boring bits interesting. So that was where the idea of counting everything the length of the trail came from. And also I realised at the end of 3 weeks of tramping, which was about 300 kilometres, that I still felt like I could keep going. So I realised that it was probably physically within my abilities to walk 10 times that distance, which is roughly the length of Te Araroa. And any of you who contributed to the New Zealand Bird Atlas scheme probably know what this map is showing. And these are the Atlas checklists that I contributed to this scheme during the 5 years that the Atlas ran, which was between mid-2019 and May this year. So I can vouch that the Wellington Hills are a great training ground for Te Araroa. It was also a good way to explore the Wellington region and contribute to the Atlas scheme. And you'll notice there's quite a concentration around the southwest corner, and that's because for quite a chunk of 2020 Ashley and Jacinda said that I had to confine myself to within walking distance from home. But it turns out you can actually go quite a long way if you're prepared to walk for 7 or 8 hours. But eventually they did let me travel further afield. But by the time, oh yeah, I should mention that most of these are day walks around Wellington, with just a couple of overnight visits to Rimataka Forest Park. But pretty much by the time Te Araroa came around, which was started in November last year, I was running out of new sites to go to around Wellington. This is probably overkill in terms of the level of fitness required. I suspect just the amount I did before Araroa, which is about, that was about a year of going out one decent walk a week, carrying a laden pack. So I would chuck a few extra tins of fruit and tomatoes in to bring my pack up to 8 to 10 kilo, and then just walking Wellington tracks. And that was more than enough. I never found the physical side of either of those tramps an issue. And I know there's a lot of people in this room whose space level and youth is sufficiently better than mine, so it shouldn't be a challenge if you set your mind to it. So what is Te Araroa? It opened in 2011, runs the length of the 2 main islands. It joins up a lot of backcountry and front country and even urban, so that plaque at top left is set into the pavers on Hortley Place. Some of these others, you'll see that the branding is joined up with the Department of Conservation, or we've got road signage. And then this next cluster, you can see I was a bit obsessed with taking pictures of Te Araroa signage. These are all between Palmerston North and Wellington. And I'm sure a lot of you, if you have ventured anywhere off road ends, will have seen some of the signage on the Southern Walkway, Northern Walkway, the escarpment track, through parts of the Tararuas. So yeah, hopefully most New Zealanders with an interest in the backcountry know about Te Araroa, and my perception is it's getting more and more media coverage in recent years, but for some reason very few New Zealanders walk the entire track. So nearly all the people we were walking with on Te Araroa were from overseas, particularly from Europe and North America. And that's where the trail goes. But before I explain a bit about the route that it follows, I need to clarify a bit of jargon with the trail. And we're going to start off with Nobo and Sobo, which are just abbreviations of northbound and southbound. And that sign is actually stuck on the Tokomaru shelter in the Northern Tararuas. And I'm not really sure why it's there, because I'd hope if you are a Te Araroa walker, you'd know pretty well which direction to head. But it's still a great image to include in the talk. Now, the next one is ELI, every last inch, which is sometimes abbreviated as EFI, with the F standing for I've forgotten. And then the next distinction is through walker versus section walker, which through walkers are people who pretty much start at one end of the country and keep going until they reach the other end. Though rest days, or 0 days as they're called on the trail, are permitted, whereas section walkers may never wish to do the whole track. They might just do bits of it, or a lot of Kiwis, New Zealanders, just do the South Island, or people might choose to do it in chunks over several years. Whereas most internationals, if they've gone to the effort and expense of getting to New Zealand, they tend to be through walkers. And that might be why we were mainly meeting people from other countries on the trail. So we were southbound every last inch through walkers, trying to count all the birds of Te Araroa. And I've been using the royal we because I did do it with my brother Gordon, shown here. Gordon is quite knowledgeable on birds. I have to say this because I know he's listening in. I saw his name among the virtual audience. He would often alert me if he'd seen or heard something interesting, but he didn't carry binoculars and he didn't try to count things, particularly if there were great masses of them. He was happy to leave that for me. But the one thing that he did do that was very helpful was he downloaded the Te Araroa app and became our navigator, which meant that I could just walk and count birds. And I should point out here that Gordon is a couple of years older than me, which means he's been telling me where to go for 61 years. But once in my life, I actually found this quite helpful. Now, the image on the right, I can vouch that was actually taken by Gordon's wife, Denise, who joined us on the Timber Trail, which is a predominantly a cycleway that combined route west of Lake Taupo. I was riding down a Shining Kuku, topical that I just heard, or we just heard. So you notice that two things there. If you look at Gordon's right hand, he's carrying a pair of walking sticks, lecky poles, which is normal for the Araroa walkers. I did have a pair, but they, for the most part, remained strapped to my pack. They were my tent poles, and they were there in case of emergencies or deep mud or rivers. But for the most part, I wanted my hands free because my preferred method for recording birds was pencil and notebook, and I'll come to that later. So now we'll talk a bit more about the route of Te Araroa. I'll just grab my glass of water. I didn't explain when I showed you this map before that the main image there is actually made up of GPS waypoints, every one of them representing an atlas checklist. There's quite a lot of them, so they kind of look all blurred until you notice where the trail breaks at a crossing Cook Strait or at Bluff, or where you reach a river or lake. You can see a bit of a circle, but if you look on the right, the image shows you a bit more clearly that the dots, for the most part, are spaced about 2 kilometres apart. And that was because I was using a GPS-enabled wristwatch that would tell me every kilometre. And so I could record the GPS waypoint every 2 kilometres and start a new checklist in between. I'll explain that a bit more later. But I'll also point out that that tiny little infographic mappy thing down on the right is also based on that same set of waypoints. Just shrunk right down, it just looks like a line at that scale. This is all way too clever and impressive looking maps, so I have to give credit here to Jazz Hamilton. So those of you who know Ambika, our regional rep, her husband Jazz is a GIS specialist and he makes awesome maps. So thank you, Jazz, if you're able to join us from Araroa. I'm not sure if you two are joining us in. Okay, so the trail, we started at Cape Reinga, down 90 Mile Beach to Araroa and Kaitaia, then east through the Raitia, Omahutu and Puketi Forest to the Bay of Islands, then down close to the coast, sometimes on it, all the way to Auckland, then across the Auckland Isthmus to Ambury Farm Park with the wader roosts there, down through the Bombay Hills to Mercer, then along the Waikato River pretty much, to Hamilton, then west to Mount Karongia, which is actually the first hut we encountered. So there's no dock huts in Karongia, and down to Waitomo and Tikiwiti. The first bulge to the east is the cycle trail, so to Araroa and the cycle trail, then to Omarui, Taumanui, Ofango. Then another bulge east on the 42 Traverse and Coca tracks to the Tongariro Alpine Crossing, which you do in reverse compared to all the day trippers. So then through Whakapapa National Park and west to Whakahoro on the Whanganui River. Now, some walkers have already jumped on the river or got into the river in a canoe at Tauranui, but most of them get into the river at Whakahoro, and they can either go to Pipariki, which is the standard 3-day break walk, paddle, break journey, whatever it's called. But a lot of Te Araroa folk arrange to paddle all the way down to Whanganui. But I'd already decided that you see and hear more birds when you're walking than when you're paddling, having done the Whanganui paddle before. So looked into minimising the time on the river, which meant walking down the Kaifakaupapa track from Whakahoro and then the Mangaparua track, so it comes out at Mangaparua Landing. And then there's about 29 kilometres, I think it is, that you have to do on the river, and that is from Mangaparua Landing to Pipariki. And you can either jet boat, or in our case, we arranged for a canoe to be delivered to Mangaparua Landing. So popped out at Pipariki, then the 3-day walk down to Whanganui, out to the coast of Whangaihu, must be about 30 km along to the coast to near Bulls, then inland to Bulls, Fielding, Bunnythorpe, Palmerston North, and then it's into the Tauranga Ranges, and it's all the way down to Raikarangi, so out to the coast at Waikanai Estuary, and south, we're almost into the Wellington section now, so south along Queen Elizabeth Park to Waikato-Riki, then the Escarpment Track, Harakiki Track, the back of Aotea Lagoons, through Porirua City Centre, over Colonial Knob, Spice Forest, all the way along up Oharu Valley, up the back of Mount Kaukau on the Skyline Walkway, the Northern Walkway, to the Fells Crack, so back of Nio, down Kalasik Park, Ipu Wairangi, down through the Botanic Gardens, but not to Zealandia. The Araroa Trail has not been designed with birds in mind, so it's not a great way to bump up your life list, but I'll come back to that. Down to the waterfront, round to Oriental Bay, up over Mount Vic, Mount Albert, Mount Houghton Bay, and it stops at Shoreland Park at Island Bay. Unless you're obsessive enough to want to walk home all the way from Cape Reinga. So I then turned around and walked 5 kilometres back to Mount Cook, where I lived, to say that I'd walked home from Cape Reinga. Unfortunately, our house isn't quite on the trail, we're on the wrong ridge line. You then have to find your own way across Cook Strait, which most people use a ferry and a water taxi to get to Chuko. But I'm fortunate to have friends who hopefully are listening in tonight, who are part owners of a yacht based at Mana Marina. So we sailed via Mana Island, where Grant Timlin, who I know is listening, former Mana Island Ranger, who was crewman on the yacht, came up to the petrol colony with me so that I could ban some of my study trips before continuing on. So fluttering sheer waters and ferry climbs fledged in mid-January, and we landed around about the 7th of January. Anyway, banded a few chicks there, then continued on to Ship Cove. So you walk the Queen Charlotte track, the link walkway to Havelock, then up the Pelorus River to Pelorus Bridge, then through the Richmond Range, which is the longest section without resupply. So we were carrying about 10 days worth of food for that, but because we needed a few days spare in case of bad weather, which wasn't required at that point. So then to Savannah, then through Nelson Lakes National Park, over the Waiau Pass, down the Waiau River, to join up the St James Walkway to Boyle Village, which is on State Highway 7, just south of Lewis Pass. And we did stop there for a day while the rain bucketed down. And the next day we took the wet weather option to avoid 2 river crossings that would be way too dangerous. Before heading up the Hope River, Uranui River, over the Harper's Pass into the Taramacau. So that's the only time the track crosses the main divide onto the west coast. Down to the Otero River, up the Deception. So we're now talking coast-to-coast trail. In fact, we were there just a day or two before the coast-to-coast, so all the temporary signage was up. So up the Deception River, over Goat Pass, down the Minga River to the Waimak, and then into Craigieburn Forest Park, so through there to the Kaya River. And that's where one of these yellow dots is, because you have to stop there and find your own way around the Kaya River. We had a night in Methven before resuming through the Hakateri Conservation Park, Ashburton Lakes to the Rangitata River. Then you do that all again, this time through Geraldine. Fortunately, I've got good friends there. And then we continued on through the Two Thumb Range to Mackenzie Country, Mackenzie Basin, rather boring trail through the Tekapo Canal, through Tekapo, Twizel, Lake Ohau. And then you cross into the Araroa catchment, which is the very southern end of Canterbury, over the Martha Saddle into Otago, pops out at Lake Hawea, so then Wanaka, through the Motatapu track to Queenstown, or Arrowtown, then Queenstown. And then you've got to take a break to get around Lake Wakatipu, up the Greenstone track, down the Mavora catchment, across the Te Anau Highway, then through the Takatimu's Twin Laws, Longwood Range to Colic Bay, then east through Riverton, Arete Beach, Invercargill, and south to Bluff. And that took us 124 days of walking. We were on the trail 131 days, so we had 7 0 days. That included crossing Cook Strait, a rain day, doing a pelagic seabird trip out to Tutukaka, going fishing in the Bay of Islands. So there actually, I think in the end, because we ended up crossing Cook Strait a day early, we had to burn a day on the Marlborough Sound, so shortly. But yeah, there were probably only 3 days when we took an actual rest day. And it was partly because our itinerary would have got complicated. We've got ahead of our itinerary. We'd always factored in a few slow down days in case we had bad weather. But we had an amazing run of weather. Anyway, some logistics. I mentioned through walkers and section walkers. Even with through walkers, quite a distinction between those who hop off a plane from overseas at Auckland, hop on a bus to Kaitaia, go to the supermarket, get a week's worth of food and get a shuttle van up to Cape Reinga and then keep doing that over and over again, versus those who plan it to the nth degree and package up all their food and courier it all around the country. And by and large in the North Island, you can get away with just popping into the supermarket. But once you hit the South Island, some supermarkets are an awful long way away from the trail. And so a lot of through walkers in the South Island will hitch, or they'll take a day out to get to Richmond walking. They might hitch to Hannah Springs, to Arthur's Pass, to Tianau. Whereas Gordon and I took the approach of buying as much as we could that we thought we need. Of course, we'd replenish when we could with cheese and fruit and things. And we couriered it or delivered it to 21 different sites around the country. This previous shot, I'd had to crop out the evening meals, which are top left there, which are the freeze-dried meals. So that was what we mainly ate in the backcountry. And you can see some of these, you might recognise the branding on some. But pretty much in the backcountry, I was boiling up water and pouring it into a freeze-dried meal. But we were both keen to support the local community. So that meant eating well when we could, so cafes and restaurants, and staying in proper accommodation when we could. And that was partly, in my case, because I'd done a bit of a deal with the devil about writing Tupapa blogs as I went in exchange for 2 days' work. And we'll come to a bit of that in the future shortly. But if you're wondering what happens to all these boxes, well, some were sent to friends and accommodation sites where there were multiple options, but at a few sites there was really only one place you could send them. And they were well promoted on the Te Araroa blog site. And so this is the Alpine Lodge at St Arnott, and you can see the boxes are like numbered up into the 600s. So they number them consecutively when they arrive. You pay a lump sum for the size of your box at this site, so that's the system they used. And then they'd have a register of your name and your box number, and so they would retrieve your box for you. Usually you don't even get to see this because I suppose it's a bit of a security risk that someone's going to pinch a box of yummier stuff than their own. But in this case, they let me in to take a photograph. So yeah, I mentioned that I've negotiated to do a couple of days paid work in exchange for weekly blogs and a conference presentation and a scientific paper. And there were a few downsides to this. It sounds like a pretty sweet deal that you can be paid more for company. Of course, one is that Araroa is a 7-day-a-week continuous walk. So effectively 5 days a week was me, whether that's weekends, statutory holidays, annual leave, a little bit of unpaid leave. But yeah, 2 days of work was a week with pay in exchange for the blogs. But I had to prepare a health and safety plan for walking 3,000 kilometres. And that was why Gordon and I wore more high-vis than anyone else on the trail. So as you can see here, even then, we still sometimes blended into the background. But the other downside was that I hadn't really given a lot of thought to exactly when I was going to write these blogs, given that we're usually getting up at 5 AM, eating our breakfast and then going walking. Then I had a lot of paperwork at the end of the day, as I'll come to. And the answer was that by and large, the blogs are written between 2 and 5 AM. Now, fortunately, they were weekly blogs, not daily blogs. But they usually did take me a couple of sessions to write. But at least I got, on average, about 5 days off before I had to have another short night's sleep in order to generate a blog. Now, if you're hoping to have lots of lovely scenic images, I'm afraid you're just going to have to make do with this, because New Zealand is a spectacular country, but I would be here all night if I dwelt on that too long. So what I've got here is roughly 1 image per week from north to south. So late on day 1, that's the view down 90 Mile Beach, then Raitia Forest, which is east of Kaitaia. This is part of the coastline between Helena Bay and Sandy Bay, so eastern Northland. The view from Te Araroa Bluff down Pakari Beach. And now we've gone through Auckland, so this is near Mercer, looking over State Highway 1 and down up the Waikato River. The view from Pahautia Hut, the very first hut we came to on Mount Prongia, part of the timber trail, so that's west of Lake Taupo. Then this is part of the Tongariro crossing, or it's from Mangatupapa Hut heading towards Whakapapa with Mount Ruapehu. Whanganui River this is actually on Christmas Eve, pouring with rain at Whakahoro. It was really the first wet day we had, and that was about 6 weeks into it. The second wet day we had, I'll show you in the next slide, was from Whanganui, so this is when we popped out on the Turakina coast with a very large colony of flat-back gulls. And then this will be familiar to those of you who've been tramping the Araroa. So this is a view from Hokimatawai looking south along the ridge. So the track goes all the way along here and up onto Mount Crawford. You can see we had a stunning day. We got to the top of Mount Crawford about 8 p.m. and didn't get down to Waiwaiwai Hut until about 11 p.m. So that was our longest day on the trail. But as you can see, we had perfect conditions, and I'll explain shortly why we put in such a long day. So that was from Matawai Hut to Waiwaiwai. And this is, well, I mentioned we sailed across Cook Strait, so the four of us moored overnight between Papa and Motuara Island, and went for a walk on Motuara in the morning before Mike and Grant dropped us at Night Ship Cove. Then this is in the Richmond Range from Mount Steerville. The next day we went over Little Rintoul and Rintoul, which are the highest peaks that the track goes on in the Richmond Range. And that was in whiteout conditions. So we had great weather this day, but as I'll show you shortly, it wasn't quite so flash the next day. Looking south from Whiteout Saddle, which is where you cross from Nelson into Canterbury. Sorry, looking back. So we just walked past Lake Constance. So Blue Lake is over here. And this is looking from Harper's Pass down the Taramakau River towards the Otira River. Then Potts River joining on to Rangitata, and in the background is the Two Thumb Range that we crossed the following day after we'd overnighted in Geraldine. Then coming off the Two Thumb Range down to Lake Tekapo with the beautiful Nurse Lake colour. Then through the Mackenzie country, and then this is the view from Breast Hill to Lake Hawea with Wanaka over here. Then the Waitatapu track, which is between Wanaka and Queenstown effectively, so the track goes up over this peak. And then this is the view at Telford campsite in the Takatimu range with a autumn dump of snow, because of course this has all taken a while. So the top image was on the day we started walking, 2nd of November. The last one, 6th of March, was 5 days before we finished. And the Tara Comms team insisted that I include human interest photos in it. And selfies and me are not a good combination. In fact, I would run a mile before I pulled a cell phone at myself. So that was another advantage of having Colin on the trail. And if you're curious, if you look at the blogs, some of them are credited to both of us, which means he grabbed my phone and took a photo. And some of them are just credited to Gordon, which means he took it on his camera. Right. And some of these images, I had thought about them in advance. So this one early on day 2, it had a caption of only 3,000 kilometres to go. Whereas the second to last one, which was actually taken on the penultimate day at the western end of Oriti Beach, was deliberately intended to mirror the first one. And that had the caption of only 65 miles to go. They were taken a very long time apart. So here we have the plugging through the mud in the Raitea forest, which until we reached the Longwood Range, that was our benchmark for muddiness. And if we ever hit mud on the trail, we'd say that the Raitea gang had picked up another contract, as in the track gang who made more mud somewhere else in the country. But that eventually was overtaken by the Longwood Range. Then this is crossing the Whananaki estuary on a footbridge. These are all north to south. Paddling across Ruakaka estuary at high tide, so you pay koha to a local guy who brings a double kayak and you take turns getting across. On the Bombay Hills, counting magpies probably. Currumbin Walkway, which is west of Hamilton. We've got that one in the, what do you call it, timber trail cycle track. Then going against the flow past Meat Crater on the outline crossing, Tonga crossing. And I assure you, I occasionally paddled going down the Pongu River. I wasn't just reporting birds, so whenever there were rapids, I would take my turn and time at times. But that was quite a short section. Then this is probably our wettest day on the trails, heading east from Whanganui, heading down to the coast of Pongaehu and along to Koitiata. Yeah, so that was to show the method used for recording birds in the rain. But as you can see for the rest of it, we by and large had amazing weather. I'm sure many of you will recognise this scene on the escarpment track heading to Pukurua Bay, crossing Cook Strait with Captain Mike on the tiller. This day crossing Mount Rintoul in the Richmond Range. For a section there, I was counting more GPS waypoints, 1 per 2 kilometres than I was birds, but there were a few birds up in the tops. Climbing up to Mount Travis Saddle in the Nelson Lakes National Park. Then this is crossing Cameron Stream near the Huranui River, and that's actually the only 3-wire bridge on the Te Araroa Trail. So if you're phobic about 3-wire bridges, you can see in most conditions you can easily cross that stream just if you have to get your boots wet. Then along Tekapo Canal, counting mallards on Lake Hawea. That was a particularly blustery day with fresh snow on the Telford Tops and the Takatimus, and then I already mentioned Reedy Beach, and then eventually getting to Stirling Point, which is the end of the trail. Typical day on the trail would be walking usually from about 6:30, 7 a.m, walking for 7 or 8 hours, sometimes longer, but often 25 to 30k would be a typical day. But you can see there are 2 outliers here, and one of them was hours per day, which was the 14 hours I mentioned in the Tararuas, and the 49k that was from Paikokariki to the back of top of Araroa Street in Nio. That was what was called slack packing, because I live in Wellington. I was able to leave all my heavier gear at home. But we were trying to make up time because Skipper Mike had told us there's bad weather coming for the Cook Strait crossing, and either we'd have to sit in Wellington for it to blow through, or we'd have to get a day ahead of schedule, which is what we did. So that was why those 2 long days, which are only 2 days apart, so that we could sail across. And then I mentioned that put us a day ahead of schedule, and rather than adjusting all our other bookings and commitments, we managed to arrange 24 hours out on Maud Island with former Lana Island Rangers Nick and Jen, where when we got there, I was presented with this rather wonderful artwork by 7-year-old Theo. And Jen assured me that he'd sort of done it off his own back, but I noticed that it did have a double attribute there with Georgia, who's 4. So I asked Georgia, what did she do, thinking she might have done some of the lovely little vignettes there. And she said, nothing. And Theo said, she was playing with her unicorns. But then Jen said, like I commented on the lovely albatross and snipe, and some of you might know that I did my PhD on snipe. But Jen then asked me, what kind of snipe is it? And my heart sank, being put on the spot on my pet topic in front of a small child. And I said, well, it's got a very long beak. And the snipe with the longest beak is the Auckland Island snipe. And Theo's eyes opened wide and he said, it is an Auckland Island snipe. Moving on. So a little bit about logistics. You need a tent. I used my tent 26 times on the trail, mainly in the North Island. We had a lucky run with huts, and there were more huts in the South Island. So this is one of the, for those of you who are sort of gear freaks, I splashed out on this one. It's we'd call it a Z pack, but others, where they come from, it's a Z pack duplex, which weighs about 600 grams. But I left the carbon fibre poles at home because I was using my dicky poles, which even though I wasn't using them to walk by and large, I thought it would be sensible to have poles in case I sprained an ankle. So I used my dicky poles to pitch the tent. But that doesn't give a lot of context for the tent. I was trying to remember to take a picture whenever I pitched it, but I did forget to, but that actually made the 24 grid easier, really missing. So I've put in a couple of shots showing different settings, and this particular one is a place called Blackbridge campsite in Omahuta Forest. So this is roughly halfway between Kaitaia and Kerikeri. And there were 18 Te Araroa walkers in the campsite that night. No one else. It's not the kind of site you get to unless you were a Te Araroa walker. Because that's actually one of the beauties of Te Araroa, is you get to quite inaccessible sites because you're just there to keep walking and you don't need to worry about how you're going to get back from the other end. You're not, you're just going to keep walking. So it's, but anyway, the site, they're nearly all European North Americans. To my knowledge, there was only one other person there other than Gordon and I who was intending to walk every last inch. So most of these people were quite happy to hitch when they reached roads or skip boring bits, or go, often go off and go diving at the Four Nights and then bus down to Auckland to catch up with their friends again or whatever. So they're a very flexible approach, which is fine. There's no rules about how to do Te Araroa. But the woman who we knew was trying to do every last inch was a Dutch woman who had walked the Te Araroa previously, before COVID, and had hitched bits of it, and she decided to come back and do the whole thing properly. But unfortunately, she tripped crossing the Okura estuary, which is near Whangaparāoa Peninsula, and got quite badly cut on oysters, and ended up in hospital and had to skip several weeks. She resumed walking in the South Island. She missed all of the rest of the North Island. So I don't know if that means she's going to come back again and do it all again, but through walking was unusual. And we were also unusual in other ways. One was our age. Nearly all of the other through walkers were half our age or even a third. So most of them were in their 20s, maybe early 30s. And we were also unusual in being siblings. We only knowingly met one other pair of siblings, a couple of German guys going in the opposite direction. Because most through walkers for doing the whole country go north to south. But in the South Island, there's quite a lot of people who are just in the South Island do it in the opposite direction. But it's quite unusual to do the whole through walk, heading north. And we found out much later that we had been given trail names. A lot of people have trail names of their own choosing, but by and large, we were known as the Bird Brothers or the Kiwi Brothers, not particularly in that universe, but there were certainly people we met on the trail that heard about us before we got there. And this is one of the few times that we did what we call wild camping. So this is in Hakateri Conservation Park with Lake Clearwater over in the background. And so this is just late in the day where we're going to put your tent near a little water course running down here. So we actually only did this twice on the whole trail, but there are places in the South Island when you're in conservation land where there's not too many constraints on where you could pitch your tent. But we were very lucky with huts. Whenever we were aiming to get to a hut, we managed to get a bunk, which is really fortunate. In fact, I've put little stars on 3 of these where we had the hut to ourselves. The first 6 are in the North Island, so nearly all the huts are in the South Island. It's just the way the network of huts is distributed. So I'm not going to name them all, though I'm sure some of you here would love to know what they all are, but I'll name a few. So Pahaotia on Mount Rongya was the very first hut we encountered. Then Mangatapopo hut was the only great walk hut. That's one we had to book in advance and make sure you're there on the precise day, otherwise it would be fully booked. Then we stayed in Moseley Shelter. This is on the Kaifakaauku track south of Whakahoro, so east of the Whangarei River. And it was on Christmas Day and we had it to ourselves, so that's nice. But we just slept in the shelter 3-sided because no one else was there. Then the next 3 are in the Araroa Forest Park, so some of you might recognise them. Then the next 6 are all in Richmond Range through to the Red Hills Hut. Then the next 3 are in the Nelson Lakes, then through Waiau Hut and then Ann Hut, which is on the St James Walkway. Then heading up Huranui and Hope and Huranui rivers, then over to Kiwi Hut, which is in the Taramakau, then up to Goat Pass, then these 2, Beeley and Hamilton Hut in the Craigieburn range, then Double Hut in the Hakateri. Then we through to the Two Thumb range, so Stone Hut and Camp Stream Hut. Then there's a big gap with no huts before you get to Top Timaru and Pakatui Hut on the way through to Hawea and Wanaka. Then Rose's Hut, which is on the Motutapu track. Greenstone Hut, which is enormous. I had to pay a bit extra for that. Then down the Mavora Lakes, the Kerry Hut, Kerry's Hut and Kiwi Hut. Then into the Takatimus with Princhester and Aparima. Then Meriview Hut and the wonderful old Martin's Hut in the Longwood range, which has been upgraded since we were there. But I'll mention Meriview Hut, which is actually privately owned. This is kind of between the Twinlaw and Longwood range in central Southland. And it's a privately owned 4-bunk hut. And I mentioned that predominant demographic on Te Araroa Trail, which is young North Americans and Europeans. In that hut that night, there were 4 bunks, 4 people. All of us were Kiwi. Gordon and I were the youngest. All 4 of us had doctor before our name. One of them was my classmate, Kevin Collier, who doc staff will remember that name. He used to work for Wildlife Service and Doc. And the fourth one, the oldest one, was actually a retired emergency paramedic who was walking the track for the third consecutive year. He is legend known as Dr. Tom, who write medical advice on the trail as he went on his blogs. And we figured that with the four of us there all being doctors, there's really only one who did any bloody use if anyone came to grief the next day on the trail, which of course is Dr. Tom, because the other three PhDs in chemistry and zoology wouldn't be of much use at all. Right, so 131 nights on the trail, mixture of front country and back country, which I'll go on to that. So in the North Island, it was nearly all front country. South Island, the ratios were reversed. But we only made use of trail angels 3 times. So this is a kind of network of voluntary, helpers, and one of them is staying in this old bus at Kaitiaki, which is west of National Park. So we really only made use of trail angels when we had no other options, but I'll point out that on 24 nights we stayed with family or friends, which is such a different experience from someone from overseas arriving here. We were able to make use of this network, including both of our wives, as we travel around the country. And even when we were away from friends and family, we had, their houses. Like, for example, on the Queen Charlotte track, we stayed at Timahia Lodge with Trevor and Jan Hook, who were former rangers from Mana Islands. And even when we stayed in the National Lakes of Blue Lake Hut, my brother-in-law Jeff hiked in and cooked us a meal. So it was actually a really social time compared with what people's perception is, that you disappear off for months and no one sees you, but actually it's a good way to connect and reconnect with people. So a little bit about trail angels, so your voluntary network, but there's other kindness that you find along the route. So this is in a hot, dry forest north of Auckland. We're just in the middle of nowhere. You find this chili bin with advice about how to get it replenished. And it turns out the woman who does this lives in West Auckland, an hour's drive each way, and she goes and replenishes the soft drinks. So that was greatly appreciated, but even more surprising was as we approached Turnbull Hut in the Longwood Range. This is about 9 AM, and coming from the left, I could see all these chili bins and poly pails, and I assumed it was hunter's rubbish, but it had trail magic written on the chili bin lids. And they had, as you can see, I pulled out a moral bar, a Sprite and an orange, but there were also craft beer in there, which I must admit that at 9 AM on the morning when I know I'm having my lunch at the Colin Bay pub, I thought it would be a bit mean to finish someone's very nice can of beer, but we were several hours from the roadie, and I don't know if the person who does this has some other way to access that site, but in the middle of nowhere, and you can see what the conditions are like. I've actually referred to it in the blog as floating in the cesspool outside Turnbull Hut. But yeah, that's part of the Longwood mud, that image. It was gruesome. Broke the spirit of other people we were walking with, but we were too close to the end to give up. Well, I've managed to get this far through without really talking about birds, but now I will mention a bit about the method I use, which is fairly traditional, pencil and paper, writing up my notes at the end of the day. I was also tabulating things in a gridded A3 sheet. A little bit of kit, so a very small pair of binoculars. They were bought specially for Araroa, but not particularly expensive. But more expensive was the Garmin Instinct 2 GPS-enabled solar-powered watch, which, if you didn't have the GPS on, you could probably walk the length of the country without needing to recharge it, but it did shoot through the batteries when I was using GPS, which I was doing every day. And so I was finding I was having to top up every couple of days from the power pack that I carried. So I had that set to give me a buzz every kilometre, and I'd set out in the morning, start my list in my notebook, and because I was usually walking and writing, you can see how illegible it is. And then after a kilometre, I get a buzz. I push a button on my watch that would give me a GPS waypoint. I generally need my reading glasses to read it, particularly if it was early morning under the forest, because it's very small fog. I write down the GPS, then I keep going for another kilometre, and at the 2 kilometre buzz, I'd start a new list and just keep going, repeat all day long. And it's a good job that I transcribed it all, because at the end of the day, I'd have to figure out what had I written in my notebook. And one memorable occasion when we just left our hut, I couldn't, that early that morning, I'd written something down and I couldn't figure out what it was. Now I need to explain here that I was also counting feral mammals. And what I remembered eventually was that a hedgehog had walked across the track soon after we left the hut, and I had written H-hog in my notebook 1, and I was trying to turn it into a bird. So that's one reason that it would make sense to transcribe all my notes, because if I tried to do it sometime later, I probably would have forgotten that I'd seen a hedgehog or whatever it was. But this is all quite a lot of effort, and so there were, I suppose, several reasons why I use this old paper-based method compared to using the eBird or Atlas app, which I never used in 5 years of atlasing. And one of them is that if you're challenged by an Atlas reviewer, eBird reviewer, and all you've done is use the app, you're relying on your memory. Oh, yes. Like in one case, I got asked by a reviewer, did you really have 21 plumlets in a 2-kilometre transit in the Richmond lane? And I sent him a scan of my notebook showing that my tally said I had 21, and he accepted that. So it wasn't an actual description of the bird, but it was evidence that my 21 was genuine, that I had counted 21. But certainly if you see something unusual, it's easier to make notes in the notebook than it is on your phone. But because I was producing blogs every week, roughly, I needed data out, basically. I needed what cumulative totals were, what was the most abundant, what was the most frequent. So that was why I was doing this tabulating, because that would be very hard to do using eBird. Technically you can, but you need Wi-Fi, and the CSV file you get of 1 line per species, it's really hard to analyze that data. So I wouldn't recommend it, but this way you can, but yeah, it takes time. But my most compelling reason for not using the app is that the thought of walking into that country using a smartphone continuously will suck the joy out of being outdoors. So it's just not me, it's not going to happen. But it does generate a lot of paper, and I did put on the trail that I probably had enough to wallpaper a small room, and I would occasionally bundle this up and courier it home or walk home and look at it. But I did realise that I had exaggerated a bit. That was all it was, and it doesn't really look enough to wallpaper a room until you realise they're all double-sided, and there were 5 notebooks and 2 logbooks. And if you photocopied it all onto single-sided and trimmed it all to size, there's actually close to 25 square metres of paper there, which is more than enough to wallpaper our spare bedrooms. And it would have the added benefit that any house guest would get a good night's sleep. I'm mainly going to be talking about live birds, but of course, whenever we're on coasts, which is about 200 kilometres, we were recording all the dead birds. And of course, with Ian here as beach patrol coordinator, I had to mention something about the birds. So we found, what does that say, 186 dead seabirds at a rate of about 0.9 per kilometre, which is not a particularly high rate, so it's not as if we're finding masses. Most notable were a couple of white-chinned petrels, one on 90 Mile Beach, one on Ariki Beach. And I'll mention here the strategic use and placement of the Araroa fecal deposit device. So I'll let you figure out what that refers to. So some actual results. So 1,823 Atlas checklists, which were mainly transits, as I described, but where I could at huts or campsites, I've also done nocturnal counts, which were point counts. 17,804 records, so that is a species at a checklist. So an average of just under 10 species per checklist with a maximum of 34. And a total of 106,539 individual birds of 111 species. But there were 4 or 5 of those that were only at night. And from now on, I'm only going to mention the diurnal birds counted during the daytime transits. 273 grid squares, so the whole country for the Atlas scheme was divided up into a 10-kilometre grid. And at the conference, where several people were given meritorious service awards for their sterling efforts on the Atlas, I was blown away that some people had in excess of 1,000 grid squares. Some of them were up to like 1,200, which is a huge. I need to mute everyone again. So I walked for 4 months and only managed to get to 273 grid squares. So yeah, amazing effort from those folks. So I'm going to run through some pretty basic Atlas type info. So what was the most frequent, what was the most common, what was the rarest, what were the differences between the 2 islands, between trail sections, but they're not going to delve into some statistics that are, well, parameters that you can't really get from eBird data. So one of them is what difference, if any, did predator trapping make? And then where are all the black fantails? So what proportion of black fantails were there in the South Island? And there are things, as I'll explain, you can't really get those out of Atlas data without having a bit more information. So, of course, the Atlas we've just done is the third one. You can look at the first two, which were published in 85 and 2007. And one thing that atlases are very good at is just presenting data on what frequency do species occur at. So if you fill in a whole heap of checklists for the whole of the country, how often do these different species appear? And these three are the ones that appear all the time: the chaffinch, silver-eye, and blackbird. Sometimes a slightly different sequence. If you drill down a bit further and just look at native species, so the number one is silver-eye, followed by fantail and warbler. And then endemic species, so things that only occur in New Zealand. Fantail was the endemic species we recorded most, nearly 50%, followed by grey warbler and bellbird. And bellbird is pretty impressive. It's there at all, really, top three, because we didn't encounter any until Reinga. So we've been walking for more than 4 weeks before we got out this bellbird, so Jackson. The one thing that atlases aren't so good on is abundance. I'll show you a bit more about this when we talk about how the new atlas will likely present data. But when you're just walking and counting, it's very easy to know what was the most abundant species. And I was actually quite surprised that the most common bird we counted by a big margin was house sparrow, because I don't really think of them as a particularly common bird, because they're mainly found around human settlements. There's a few in the farmland, but they're really not in the backcountry forest at all. But just the sheer numbers we were encountering mainly in North Island towns, they were the only species that was in 5 digits, followed by chaffinch. And then 2 species that appear here, red-billed gull and black-packed gull. At places we did encounter very large colonies, so we had an estimated 2,500 red-billed gulls at Marsden Point breeding colony, and I think it was 1,300 black-backed gulls on the Turakina coast, Rangatiki. So their numbers were conflated plus some very big colonies. But again, bellbird, even though we didn't get them until we were going for a month, still made it into the top 3 in human birds. Then comparing the 2 islands, they were really quite different. And one thing I'll point out is just the sheer numbers. You know, the North Island, if you look at number 10th ranked, silver-eye, 2,740, the top rank in the South Island, ironically the same species, wouldn't have even made it with the top 10 on the North Island. The North Island is slightly longer. The midpoint of the trail is just south of Palmerston North. So even though the South Island's a bigger landmass, the North Island is actually a longer landmass. But as you can see, there are only 3 species that were shared in the top 10 by abundance. And then the South Island, because there's a bit more backcountry forest, you've actually got endemic landbirds, bellbird and tonga among the top 10. And one thing you can do very easily when you're just walking north to south is record the first and last sightings or hearing of each species. And in the blogs, I was doing that as I encountered things for the first time. But of course, it's only really in hindsight, once you've got to the end of the trail, that you know the last time that you got something. And in theory, you can get this kind of data out of an atlas, but it's a bit more complicated because you've got to superimpose your route on the maps. And then these days, atlas maps, as I'll show you, are a model of data. You don't actually know, is that boundary representing an actual bird or is it an estimated bird kind of thing. Whereas when you're just walking, it's very well known. And there were things that interested me in hindsight. One was that the very last shining cuckoo we heard was in the Spicer Forest, very close to here at Araroa. We didn't have one at all in the South Island, and that's just a seasonal thing. So we heard our last cuckoo call, shining cuckoo, on the 10th of January, and our last long-tailed cuckoo on the 5th of February. So we were going through forests where their host species would be much further south, but they pretty much shut up at the end of the breeding season. I won't bother going into the rest of that, but it's a table from a paper that's been submitted to Notornis. So those of you who are members and want to know, you can read it in great detail, hopefully, if it gets through the review process. The bird watchers are much more interested in the rare things. So there are some people, this is their main motivation for bird watching, is to find rare things, particularly the vagrants and the things with the V. Two of those are effectively self-found, so I didn't know they were there. So the common tern on 90 Mile Beach and the chestnut-breasted shelduck. So I have submitted unusual bird reports for those, whereas the other vagrants there were already known by other people. Probably the wandering tattler was the most notable of them for me. In my case, that was only the third I've seen in New Zealand in 48 years of bird watching. So it's a pretty rare species, and it's got a great name as well as being a cool bird. So I thought that would actually be a good byline for what I was doing, which is wandering the length of the country telling people about the birds. So it hasn't quite caught on as a nickname, but I can think of worse ones. But whereas some of these other species are genuinely rare, and Gordon made some comment that this was the only bird he saw we let out a whoop of delight about, because we'd actually been told we wouldn't see blackstock. We'd met up with dock staff the day before at Tysel, and they said they're pretty much gone, we're there too late in the season, but we had that one on the Ohau River. So a genuine rarity, and there's only maybe 180 blackstilts in the wild. And of course, Britain getting increasingly rare, so the only one we had there was just north of Whangarei Harbour. But some of the other birds are just quite cryptic. I was a bit surprised that we only saw one. We'd never heard a little owl, and the only one we saw was at Colin Bay, so right near the end. The only red-crowned parakeet was in Wellington Botanic Gardens because it's an overflow from Zealandia. And of course, we had yellow-crowned in quite a few places. But there were other genuinely rare birds. I'd only ever seen one Nankeen night heron before in New Zealand, out on Kapiti Island, which I'm sure there were some people in the room who saw that same bird. And this first one I saw, it's not my photograph, it's a stunning photograph by Paul Gibson, but it's very similar to the view that I had, because I was standing at the door of St. Joseph's Chapel, which is supposedly the most photographed church in New Zealand. This is at Jerusalem, Araroa, on the Pomenui River. And this is the Turanga Waiwai for Nankeen night heron. So the very first recorded breeding event was at Jerusalem in 1995, in a tree very close to the chapel, which has since partially died. And so these birds are very secretive. They nest and roost in deep foliage. And as the name suggests, they only come up at night. But I was standing at the door of the church when there was this almighty clatter behind me, which is a truck dumping a load of rocks. And it startled this bird out of its daytime roost. And I turned around, and I'm sure some of you have had this, particularly when you're overseas, that you see something that's really striking, but you don't know what it is. And it's just that split second of, because I've never seen one of these things in flight. What is that? And my first species that jumped to mind was barney. Big and pale face, broad, buff-coloured wings. But a split second later, it turns slightly this angle. You can see the dangling legs. And of course, I know, I'm in the Whanganui catchment. It will be one of these. But this is really cool because the place where people go to see night herons now is a place called the Upokonaro, the backdoor cafe at Upokonaro, much further down. You're several days' walk further down the valley. And no one has reported them at the Turanga Waiwai of New Zealand night herons for quite a few years. And so the people who keep tabs on them, who we met up with, were really interested to hear that they are still hanging on near where they were first reported, which is now 30 years ago. But as I mentioned, we did get to see them at Upokonaro. We met up with 3 Birds New Zealand members from the Whanganui branch. We're now talking 30th of December, I think. So they gave up part of their summer break to meet us at the cafe. And it's a great place to stop and have a cuppa and look at birds. But we also went back at dusk. You can't get into the courtyard at dusk, but by standing on the opposite side of the road, you can see these nocturnal birds coming and going in the dusk. So very, very cool birds and a very special place to see them. And something I didn't talk about much in the blogs, because I was trying to focus on the positives, not the negatives, were the things that I failed to see. So the one that I did mention, because I was really quite surprised, was the chuckle. After walking for hundreds of kilometres through dry upland country in the South Island, why didn't I see or hear a chuckle? And I don't know the answer. I suspect they're way scarcer than people realise. So we'll be interested to see how many do get reported when the atlas scheme is written up. But all of these other species with a bit of luck you could have on the trail, certainly the crapes with a bit more effort. One of the problems there is that they are mainly active at dawn and dusk. And if you've been walking all day and you don't have a vehicle, the thought of popping back 10 kilometres to a choice-looking wetland because it might be crapes at dusk, it's not going to happen. But with a bit more inside knowledge, from local people about good places that are close to where you might stay, I'm sure you could get one or both of those crapes. Kokako, I've certainly known people who have had them very close to the trail on Porongia and Araroa and even Puketi. But by and large, the trail just misses them. With a bit of tweaking and putting them on adjacent ridges where there is pest control, you probably could get them. But we didn't hear kookaburra, which even though they're present north of Auckland, I have seen them there before. I was a bit surprised we never heard them. And I know people who have seen rock wren very close to the trail, but by and large the trail goes through valley floors and over passes. It doesn't go over peaks. And so you probably have to do a few dog legs. And I was actually trying to stick to the trail partly because I was putting down a baseline, that others can compare with in future. So if I did a dog leg and missed the trail for a day or two just to get rock wren and then come back on, it would be great to see rock wren, but it wasn't really what I was intending to do. Now, I've mentioned a bit about the three atlases, and I'll just refresh your memories a bit. So the very first atlas, all that was recorded was presence absence. So every square that they used, which is 10,000 yard, it shows you how old it was just presence absence. Whereas in the second atlas, which was published in 2007, if you've got really good eyesight, you'll see that those little red dots are different sizes. So each dot represents what proportion of checklists had that species. And I've actually chosen fantail for a very specific reason. So it's not telling you abundance, it's telling you what proportion of checklists for that square had that species. And to some extent, that's what we're expecting for the final checklist. This is a bit blurry because it's a screenshot, but this gives you an idea of the kind of heat map that will be generated by the third atlas data, which is a very clever set of algorithms that take into account terrain, vegetation, time of day, observability, probably things I'll skip my mind, but there's quite a few different factors that get factored in to model the distribution of, in this case, fantail based on the actual data. So, as I touched on before, if you're seeing a shaded part of the country, you don't actually know that the fantail was there. It's just that the data is telling you that it should be there. So it's a great looking map, but it does have some fuzziness about whether it's actual data or model data. And it has, all of these maps have challenges. Like if I asked you, how many fantails do you think you'd see between Twizel and Wanaka? Or if I gave you all of these maps of all of these species, can you rank the top 10 species you'd see between Twizel and Te Anau? Or what about what proportion of black fantails would you see in the South Island? And that's a complete zip because we used a USA-based database that did not factor in colour morphs, so different colour varieties. And so much we debated this at the time that we were looking into that as council. Could we get a bespoke module to ask what portion of those fantails are black and what are pied? And it was going to be too expensive and difficult. And yes, you can record it in the notes field, but by and large, people are motivated to do that when they're seeing the black ones, which are much rarer. And you don't know their level of motivation to do it for the pied ones. So unless you know that particular observer always records black versus pied, you've got to discard their data as being biased. So I'll come back to that shortly. But yeah, there's part of why I was looking into this is, of course, the atlas is going to be written up, and I didn't want to write the Te Araroa Trail as a mini atlas. I was trying to think what data stories can I tell that are different from the atlas. And one of the challenges I had is how do you describe everything everywhere all at once, which is all the birds of New Zealand affecting the length of the country. And then I realised that I kind of had fallen on the answer even before I set out, because I've done this deal of roughly a blog per week. And I decided at the outset to break that up by the main towns that we walked through, because people could understand if you're talking about the birds between Hamilton and Auckland or vice versa, or between Kaipara and Kerikeri, they can kind of picture where you're talking about. Whereas if you just chose equidistant spaces in the middle of nowhere and gave a GPS waypoint, no one would know what you're talking about. And then I realised that when you look at the Araroa website and you download their maps and notes, they use provincial boundaries, which are generally remote ridges between catchments. So, for example, Waiao Saddle between Nelson and Canterbury is the boundary between Nelson Province and Canterbury. But to get there is a 3-day walk. So yes, you could helicopter in, it's quite an appropriate metaphor in this case, but if you can get permission. But who would be starting their walk at the Canterbury boundary? And then, of course, if you walk south from Canterbury, it takes 3 weeks before you hit the Martha Saddle to get into Otago. So it's a huge chunk of land. So these weekly blogs turned out to be a nice bite-sized chunk that people could visualize where you're talking about. And it actually worked out a bit for the blog writing, because by and large it meant that I had electricity and furniture and it was time to write another blog. So all of that was a consequence rather than a deliberate decision at the start, but it meant that I could use those 19 chunks, which I've now alternated the colour. No, I asked Jazz, can you alternate the colour to highlight the different 19 sections. So I produced tables of the 10 most abundant species and the 10 most frequent species of each of those 19 sections. And I could have included them in this talk. They're in the paper, but it would have made it long and tedious. So I've decided that I'll go short and tedious instead and show you a single graphic that summarises all 106,000 birds of 106 species, all in one graph. And here it is. Blinded by silence. Silence. This is a matrix of Bray-Curtis dissimilarity indices comparing all birds of all 19 transects the length of the country. So I better explain a bit about what you're looking at. So I've numbered all the transects from 1, which is Cape Reinga to Kaipara, through to 19, which is the Tiana Highway to Bluff. And they're all in sequence. So everything above that horizontal line is comparing the North Island with the North Island. Everything to the right of the vertical go away. And what I've done is I've converted all the bird counts into birds per kilometre to standardise for the length of each transect. Interesting. Hopefully people can still see that.
Yes.
Cool. And then this compares all the transects, and I've then colour-coded the different numbers. If you've got 2 transects, I'll just explain, if you've got no birds in common, so completely different species, you get a value of 1. And then if you've got exactly the same species and they occur at the same rate, birds per kilometre, you'll get a value of 0, which sounds incredibly implausible until you look near the right-hand corner. Some of those values are actually really close to 0. So some of those transects were very similar to each other. But the overall pattern is actually there's not much pattern. So most of the colours are mid-colours. They're kind of, each transect was roughly the same or roughly different to everything else, except for a really obvious one at the left there. So transect number 1 was really different from everything else. So that's Cape Reinga to Kaipara. And that's hardly surprising. You're walking along an exposed sandy coast for 90 kilometres. And then you're walking through farmland to get to Kaipara. So there's no forest. So that transect was very different from anything else. But the next pattern there is that the next transect, which is Kaipara to Kerikeri, is very different to all the South Island. So you've got brown below the line. And I think that is driven by 2 things. One of them that it's entirely interior, so there's no coastal birds. And by and large, coastal birds are pretty much the same all around the country. But there are quite a lot of species that you get in the North Island that you don't get in the South Island, or that are very scarce there. So there are things like rhino, eastern rosella, brown quail, peacock, turkey, even shining cuckoo, as I've shown, kingfisher. probably a few others that have slipped my mind. So I think that's what's really driving the difference there. Battery running low, we're going to replace it in. But if you want to be moving, if anyone needs to leave, let me know, so I can swipe you out. It's going to be way too long. So long the battery telling me it's going flat. Right. Oh, but yeah. And over the right, South Island transects are very, very similar to each other. So this is the central South Island. Really boring, actually. It's just skylights and yellow hammers and really nothing to point to people. Sorry for all the extras. But one other thing, I haven't put this into the paper, but those of you who know the Birds of the Great Walk blogs know that I developed this index of birdaciousness, which is basically scoring the endemism of birds of the different Great Walks. And if you apply that to the Araroa sections, you can see the best parts of the country for endemic birds, so they're the ones in red, or turning it around, the worst parts, which are the ones in purple. So if you're limited time or you just want to pick which are the best parts of Te Araroa for endemic birds, then potentially you could use this information. But at this stage, you have to go to the blogs to extract it. The score is in each of the individual blogs, but I haven't yet lumped it all into one place other than in this slide. Okay, the question of does predator trapping make any difference? And I talked briefly about this at the conference, just using these two species, tomtit and bellbird, but I've now crunched the numbers on a whole heap of endemic birds. And many of you will know that when you walk through New Zealand forest trails, you often see boxes that look like this, which usually these days contain a DOC 150 or DOC 200 trap that are set to target stoats and shipwrecks. Those are the species that they should be able to track and kill. There are other traps you'll encounter, and some of this is quite confronting on the trail. I had some quite interesting discussions with people from overseas when they put this kind of thing. And fortunately, this one came with a health and safety. Don't poke your fingers into the hedgehog. The spacing of these traps is usually every 100 or 200 metres. And the point that I made at the conference was that for two species, bellbird and tomtit, they weren't benefiting from trapping at all. And I have included this graph because what I'd like to point out here is the difference in the sample sizes. So some species like tomtit and fantail and grey walker pretty much occur throughout the country. And so I've presented data on roughly 1,000 kilometres of forest transect, of which about a quarter was trapped. But for other species, they're much more limited in their distribution. So I've already mentioned bellbird, we didn't encounter until we're south of Hamilton. So the sample sizes are much smaller. So just be aware of that when you look at this next table, which again is in the Matorna's paper. But what I've done here is I've ranked them all from the species that appear to benefit from trapping at the top to those that, if anything, are worse off in the presence of trapping. But this all has to be taken with a rather large grain of salt, because you've got to remember that I don't know the history of each site. For example, I don't know when was the last 1080 drop. How long has the trapping been in place? But one that, an odd one here is why do weka seem to be so much better off in the absence of trapping? And that is an artifact because they have only just recolonised Nelson Lakes National Park. So the traps have already been there. So in effect, it's gone from 0 weka to a few weka. So that's an example where you do need a bit of information to interpret what this is showing. But just point out, the overwhelming signal is that nearly all of these birds do not benefit from the level of pest control that they are exposed to. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not affected by predators. It just means that putting out traps at 100 or 200 metre spacing is not killing enough predators. It might be getting rid of the stoats or enough of them for things that are vulnerable to stoats, so kiwi and whio particularly. These data aren't about these species. I didn't encounter enough kiwi or whio to present data on how much they benefit from pest control. But it's showing a lot of the smaller birds. And when you think about it, the basic food pyramid, that stoats are the top of the pyramid. And roughly 100 shipwrecks for every stoat. So the number of stoats, sorry, if you just think of a little bird nest, the chances that a stoat will encounter a bird nest, any one nest, is about 1/100th of the chance that a shipwreck will encounter it. So if you want to get rid of the main predators that are hitting these small forest birds, you've got to have a method that will control shipwrecks at a landscape level. And that is the reason why conservationists are so pro 1080, because it gets rid of the shipwrecks. It also gets rid of the stoats, it gets them on with secondary poisoning. But scat rats are incredibly difficult to keep on top of in a dense forested landscape. And this is kind of showing it on a whole of New Zealand scale, is that the level of pest control that is out there is just not enough. Except, and this was to my mind really intriguing, the two species that seem to benefit most from the current level of pest control are tui and kereroo. And that's puzzled me for several decades now, is why are those two species bouncing back? You know, they're doing so much better, particularly here in Wellington. And I think the answer is that they're relatively robust, that just a small amount of predator control makes a difference. And so this is quite intriguing that on a whole of New Zealand scale, there's a bit of a signal there that tui and kereroo are able to benefit from the level of pest control that's currently out there. So if you're a community trapper anywhere in the country listening into this, those are your two target species, because they will show you a result. The other ones will be much harder to turn them around unless you're doing things on a much more intensive scale than a linear trap line of every few hundred metres. Okay, the final burning topic I was going to touch on is where have all the black fantails gone? And as I mentioned, eBird data is not really going to give this to you. What you need to do is go to individual contributors and ask them, probably via our newsletter or targeted emails, and ask, did you routinely count how many black, how many pine? And I should explain here that for those who are unfamiliar, that the black fantail is a genetic mutation effectively. It's once black, they're always black. And that is actually the reason that I prefer the name morph rather than phase. So some field guys refer to it as the black phase and the pied phase. But to my mind, that implies that they change over time. It's like the phase of the moon or an obnoxious teenager going through an emo phase that they'll grow out of. But the idea is that this, if you use another term that shows that they're constant, I'll come back to that. And so I was surprised walking the trail how few black fantails we saw. And so I then looked into where did my perception come from, because I was expecting roughly 1 in 8 would be black. And the actual number is way lower than that. And if you look into, I suppose, the secondary sources, and these are like handbooks and field guides and things, what numbers do they give? And intriguingly, the earliest one I could find that mentions this at all was Oliver in 1955. Earlier writers like Buller and Hutton and Drummond didn't mention the ratio. And the reason they didn't is they treated them as two different species. So they would no more talk about the ratio than we would talk about the ratio between black shag and pine shag. Why would you? They're different species. But Oliver was the first to talk about this. And I'll come back to this, but he was the one that came up with this number that is referred to as 25% black. And that number seems to be repeated later on, right through to some current, like the Stoker of the Stevenson book, uses 25%. But from the mid-70s onwards, we start to see a figure of 12%, which is the number that I have in my head, that 12%, 1 in 8 is black. But some of those publications, so Robertson 85, that's the Reader's Digest book of New Zealand birds, Heather and Robertson Field Guide, Hansa, they fudge it, they use both figures, 12 to 25. And then there's just a couple of recent Resources, the Birds Online website that uses 5%, and Oscar Thomas's little book also uses 5%. So much smaller numbers. So where did those three numbers come from? 25%, 12%, 5%. Well, Oliver actually explains to a certain extent. He mentions this ratio on 2 pages, but he worded it in a really clumsy way. What he says is that the black makes up a quarter of the amount of the pie. So what he's actually talking about is 1 in 5. So there are 4 times as many pie as there are black. So the number that should have been attributed to Oliver was 20%, but it seems to be consistently misquoted as 25%. So where did he get it? He attributed it to Mrs. Tilly. Now, W.I.B. Oliver used to work for this institution. He was the director of the Dinner Museum, and he kept meticulous notes. And so I was able to call up his fantail folder from archives to look at where did he get this 25% from. And he cut it out. This is what he did and pre-photocopied that. So New Zealand Bird Notes was the precursor to the Taurus. So he cut out this page from the very second volume of Bird Notes, 1947. And there's a few really interesting things here. The first one I'll comment on is that one R.A. fellow from Christchurch commented that the high proportion of black fantails is still noticeable in Canterbury. What's high? Is it 5%? Is it 95%? Who knows? But then we do have some actual data from IT. This is Isabella Tilly, who lived in Maori Hill in Dunedin, and she's reporting very precise percentages in her garden, outside her garden, and then Dunedin Naturalist Field Club also has statistics from the same period beyond. And it turns out that Isabella and Harry Tilly are stalwarts of the Dunedin Naturalist Field Club. So Oliver attributed all of this data to Isabella Tilly. Now, where did he get 20% from? Well, if you take the average of those 3 percentages, it comes to 20%, which seems rather coincidental. But of course, that's very dodgy statistics if you don't know the sample sizes. And so I then looked at what would be the minimum number of fantails that would give you those very precise percentages. And of course, we don't know, but those are the figures there. It's roughly 83, or whatever the number is, 15 black, 67 pied. And if you look at the top and third, 5 black, 37 pied, you'd have to double that to get the same precise ratio. And so I think those numbers are probably correct. The middle one could be a bit dodgy, that's only 9 birds to give you that percentage. So even if you multiplied that by 4 to get it to a similar sample size to the other 2, the point I'm making is that this, whoops, I need to use my little pointer, the number is less than 20%. It might be as low as 18.3%, but somehow it's been misinterpreted as 25% for the last 80 years. Okay, so where did the 12% come from? Graham Corley was at Canterbury University, and he and Chris Kellys counted the ratio of the 2 on the west coast in Canterbury. 342 birds came up with 12.9%. Around about the same time, John Craig was then a master student at Otago University, and he came up with a very similar proportion, 11.8%. And when you combine that with Corley's numbers, which he did because the paper was published 3 years later, it gets up to a very large sample size of nearly 3,000 with a proportion of 12.1% black. And then Mary Powslin did her master's at Kofi Bush in the late 70s, and when that was published, she came up with a proportion of 13.2%. And I included this in here because it's another geographic location. So we've now got quite good geographic coverage. Combining them all together, it's a figure of about 12.2% black, or 1 in 8. And that was the number that I had stuck in my head before we got off. But what I've forgotten about was Catherine Atkinson's study with Jim Brisky, the supervisor, published now 17 years ago. And she did a single summer survey, 470 birds throughout the South Island, 4.9% black, so way lower. And now it's time for the big reveal that on Te Araroa, I saw 359 fantails in the South Island, 20 black, 339 pi, 5.6% black. But being a bit of a pedant for note taking, of course, I've done this every time I've been to the South Island, even before the Atlas. So I can go back for the last decade or so, and I've got data on another 635 fantails. But I'm quite biased in all my samples because all of my records are from west of the Araroa Trail. I never go to the eastern South Island because it's too boring. So all the data and Marlborough Sounds and Yorkland and all the great walk tracks, none of all from Araroa, so I didn't see any black fantails on Araroa. Rachel Sagar assures me that you see one in her garden, but then I've seen one in my garden at Mount Cook and Wellington. So they do occasionally get across Cook Strait and Bobo Strait, but basically they appear to be absent from Araroa. But if you add all of my own samples together, just under 1,000, 4.8% black, 0.1% different from Catherine Atkinson's study. So for some reason, fantails seem to have gone from 12-something% in the 1970s, 80s down to about 5% now. I think you can disregard the 25% or the 20%. It was based on a very small area at the second end of the Second World War. The figures have gotten anyway for about 3 different reasons, and I've been misquoted ever since. But it does intrigue me that that 25% still appears in Anzac and Heather and Robertson and Stoker and Stevenson. So the take-home message from that is that misinformation has a very long half-life, which is very worrying given the era that we live in. But yeah, I won't take a lot of credit for the 5% in New Zealand Birds Online. I edit the site, but the thing that I did most cleverly there was recruit good authors. So Ralph Towson did the scholarship. Mary did the research on fantails back in the 70s, but Ralph wrote that page. He knew about Catherine Atkinson during Bristol's paper, and then told Oscar Thomas fessed up that he just used Birds Online because it's such a reliable source of information. But the misinformation doesn't end there. I was just writing this last week where Alan Henderson brought this to my attention here in Central Park. A children's book has been turned into a series of interpretation panels, and at the very end there's some factoids, which gets the percentage right, 5%. But it says some South Island fantails turn black between the seasons. Well, there's a bit of chuckling going on here because, of course, it's bollocks. It's a genetic mutation that never changed. But I tactfully contacted Marianne Day, the author of the children's book. Her website details are on these panels. Notice her address, Araroa Road. She is Ralph and Mary's neighbour in the Outer Marlborough Sounds, probably the least populated place on the, I was going to say on the planet, but in New Zealand. But what are the chances of that? 2 of the leading gurus on New Zealand fantails being neighbours of this. Maybe that was why she was inspired to write her book about New Zealand fantails. But Marianne was mortified when I pointed this out because she knew damn well that black was a genetic mutation. And she admitted that it had been edited and she had neglected to check. Now, she didn't mention ChatGPT, but I suspect that what's happened here is that this particular phrase, and she told me this is what it's based on, this is from Paul Stoker and Brent Stephenson's book. Up to 25% of South Island birds may be black in some seasons. Now, I haven't asked them why they added in some seasons, but I suspect they wrote the 25%, which I've already told you is dodgy bollocks. And they thought, that's dodgy bollocks. If we put in some seasons after it, no one can pin us down and say that they've never seen 25% black. But if you run that through ChatGPT or something similar, morph changes into turn. Because I've forgotten to look at, scientists use morph because it's Greek from structural morphology. But in common parlance, particularly CGI, it's used derived from metamorphosis to change from one thing to another. So if you run that phrase through an editing program, it will tell you that these things change between seasons. So I'm going to blame ChatGPT, but it's just a reminder of how A, we need to be very careful about the way we use language, and B, we need to remember that when we as scientists use a word, that it might be completely misinterpreted by other people. Now that's getting a long way away from Te Araroa, so we should probably get back to the trail here. And this is a picture that I actually took on my cell phone. One of the very few bird images I took on the trail, which of course is a very large flock of Canada geese on the New River estuary. And way in the background, disappearing in the murk and the rain as it often does, is Bluff Hill, Motopuri, which is where we're heading on that last day. Which gets me back to the title of the talk. I referred to every last bird, which of course was really ripping off every last inch. But what was the last bird that I saw on the trail? And there are several ways you can define this. I must admit, at this point, I was hopefully looking for a fishing boat coming in. I was thinking there might be an albatross following it. But there are several ways you can define the last bird. It could be the last species. I mentioned there were 111 species that I saw on the trail. Or it could be the last bird I wrote in my notebook. So as I came down off Bluff Hill down to Stirling Point, what was the last species I wrote down? Or it could be the very last individual bird that I saw as I scanned before I lowered my binoculars and became a nappy. And I need to explain that's yet another acronym, but not another effing inch for when you've had enough. But in this case, I'm exaggerating, because I then actually walked half a day back up the road to some mutton burning friends for a cup of tea. No one could tell them, but I walked to be a place from Cape Reinga as well. So I did continue walking. But the answer for all of three is actually the same species, sooty shearwater. So we first started seeing them as we walked down the west side of Bluff Peninsula. I think we saw 55 or something by the end of 3 transects. But it is actually quite an apt bird to be the final one on the trail, because they regularly fly down to the pack ice to feed when they're feeding their chicks. They fly up to the North Pacific on migration every year. They live for in excess of 30 years, so they probably fly in excess of 3 million kilometres in their lifetime. So a good bird to put a mere 3,000 kilometres into perspective. So that's the end of the birds, but just a little bit more about trail culture. One of the things I didn't do much in the blog was talk about what I was eating. And that was partly that because they're Te Papa blogs, I didn't really want to be doing much product endorsement. Or heaven forbid that I'll be accused of being an influencer. But I did put in this image because people want to know about Christmas. And this is the goodies that I carried west from National Park. And we had to go slow for a few days from Whakahoro because the jet boating companies didn't operate on Christmas Day or Boxing Day. So we just walked short distances for 3 days before we picked up our canoe on the 27th. And so we had Christmas by ourselves in Mosley's shelter on the Whakakuakas track, which is about a day's walk north of the Bridge to Nowhere. So I called that bridge Christmas North of Nowhere. So a few goodies. I'll make the point that I don't routinely carry alcohol when I'm tramping. The only other exception was that Gordon's birthday was west of Twizel, so I carried a bottle of wine for him or for his birthday, but that was on Christmas Day. But if you look at the freeze-dried meal, that was carefully selected. That was my favourite. You know, all of the brands I had 4 different brands, had different curries, but most of them were just so bland. But that one gave me hiccups the first time that I had it, because it was so hot. So I scored it 5, because I had a scale for scoring the 4 different brands I had and the 28 different flavours. And I scored them on flavour and fulsomeness. Now, of course, that's a completely incorrect use of the word fulsome. But before the pedants take me to task on it, I'll explain that if I replaced it with satiety, people will be reaching for their dictionaries or their smartphones. So you know what I mean, even though it's correct. So I was scoring each of these meals on a 10-point scale, 5 points for flavour, 5 points for fulsomeness. It's not a full consumer index here, because of course I'm not putting in cost or weight or calories. But if you've got really good eyes, if I go back here, you'll see that it says that gluten-free serves 2. Bollocks. If you're a hungry Te Araroa walker, it's not bad. But I lost 9 kilos between Cape Reinga and Wellington. I realised that that was unsustainable. So I started buying more cheese and nuts in the South Island. But all of my freeze-dried meals were served to if they were available, but some brands don't do that. So yeah, it's not a full consumer comparison, but if you just look at the two things that you really worry about when you reach a hut is, does it taste good and does it fill you up? I'm going for the Outdoor Gourmet Company, which is actually the same brand as the Backcountry. It's just the sort of more upmarket version. But that one, which is the most readily available, actually, to my mind, ranked number 2. So they're perfectly acceptable, particularly when you're in the backcountry and you don't have many other options. So, but that comment about losing weight, when I got to the end, one of my workmates actually commented on my final blog that he wished New Zealand was twice as long because he was enjoying the blog so much. But I estimated that if I was able to go for another 3,000 kilometres and it took me another 4 months, I'd be very close to Scott Base by the middle of July and nothing left to me. So I'm quite glad that it did finish moving July. Now, I showed you earlier on that I was a bit obsessed with signage. So I thought I'd just share with you 2 particular signs. I'm sure I could have filled any number of signs with misused apostrophes and misspelled accommodation, but that would be a bit tedious. So instead, I'll show you 2 that particularly appealed to me. And this first one was South Playable Islands. And it made me wonder, what is the alternative? Maybe they were going to catch the dog, take it away off-site and get it euthanized by the vet. But the next one actually needs a little bit more explanation because Gordon and I stayed when we were in Huntly in a former maternity hospital that had been sold into private ownership, and it's been turned into some kind of retreat for meditation. And the Asian couple who run it had put various profound and thought-provoking statements on the walls of each room to set the vibe for this meditation. And I fear at times that their enthusiasm for the task ran ahead of their grasp of the English language, because this is what it had on the wall of my room. But by time moment is not measured by clocks. And I stared at it for a while, and the penny dropped. They've got the decals mixed up. And what it was supposed to say is time is not measured by clocks, but by moments, which of course is a complete load of fiffle. If you're a hard-nosed scientist walking the length of the country using a solar-powered GPS-enabled stopwatch to record precisely how long it takes to walk 2 kilometres, you know damn well that time is indeed measured by clocks, regardless of what any math hippie speak slogans trying to tell you. But for some reason, this stuck in my brain like an earworm. This was only a month into the trail. But by the time I reached Bluff, and I should explain here that Gordon and I had a very good incentive to keep walking, because my son Karen was getting married 5 days after we finished back in the Wairarapa. And by the time I reached Bluff, this had turned into an entire wedding speech about maybe we all pursue time moments throughout our lives, things that are memorable, that we'll hold on to and cherish and share. As I said, it's an entire wedding speech. I'm not going to give it all to you, but I will say that I'm glad I took a photo because I presented Karen and Tess with a framed copy of it at the wedding, hanging on their house or this church. And of course, there's a heap of people to thank here. Number 1 has to be my brother Gordon for putting up with this slightly crazy brother for 3,000 kilometres. So many people who helped us along the way. Hopefully some of our trail walkers have joined us, even from other countries. I sent the link to a few folk. The comms team at Te Papa were wonderful. The blogs were handwritten, and I would photograph them and send them to my wife, Kate. So there she is typing up a Te Papa blog. She would then forward them to the Te Papa comms team, and I've arranged in advance with quite a few photographers for Birds Online that we could use their images without having to get additional permissions. So in the end, the blogs contained 107 images by 42 photographers. Jazz with the Mac, Nikki McArthur and Dan Bergen were very helpful with me trying to turn all that data. I got it into a spreadsheet. Getting a spreadsheet into eBird was not straightforward. Lots of fish hooks along the way, including if you use the word Te Araroa as a place name, it grouped them all together. Oscar pointed this out to me. He said, "Why have you got sewer buntings and bellbirds north of Kaitaia?" And it's because I used the name Araroa over and over again. It didn't take the GPS coordinates. I had to go through and rename 1,700 locations so they all had unique names. So yes, it's not a straightforward process. So maybe there is an advantage of using the app, even if you're totally miserable entirely on trail because you're using the smartphone. But yeah, that's probably enough. If you want to know more and you haven't found the blogs already, please do go and find them. And you're at home and you're suddenly inspired to learn more about birds, check out the Birds New Zealand website. Thank you very much.
Colin, speaking on behalf of the council, could I, on behalf of us all and for the 62 people who are online, obviously, could I thank you very much indeed for the delivery, for the content, for the interest, and for the fascination of this wonderful journey. It must be the longest ornithological transit ever conducted in the country, over 3,000 k's, but it was superb, and we want to thank you very much again for your very significant contribution to us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Now, I think I saw some comments popping up, so bear with me with a bit of a technical Luddite. I might be able to figure it out if there are. But if anyone's at home and have got questions, you're welcome to chat.
I've been keeping an eye on the chat and I don't see any direct
No comments?
no direct questions.
Red dot.
Okay. You didn't see the ghost kokako. No, I did actually carry 2 hats with me in case I saw a South Island kokako and had to eat one of them, because I am the uber skeptic when it comes to South Island kokako. I think they've been extinct for 100 years, but whatever. If someone gets paid what is it, $10,000, I want to see the evidence that's based on. But until then, please don't bug the Records Appraisal Committee, because we've got more than enough to do than telling people no, it's a California quail, which it has been a few times when we've had the videos sent. Anyway, another topic.
Colin, were there any particular, the 120 odd days and nights that you were travelling along, were there any areas or any days or geographic features which were particularly challenging to you and Gordon that you really felt uncomfortable about?
To be honest, I would occasionally comment to Gordon, when does it get hard? And yeah, walking the hills around Wellington and doing transects on Kapiti Island is more challenging. You know, you're off piste, and there are places where I was quite comfortable walking on steep slopes with very little trail, and other people were saying in their comments on the Te Araroa Trail, that's really dangerous. I slipped 3 times, but no, I didn't find it physically challenging at all. But I should say, guys, I still have numb soles to my feet. I seem to have done something with my nerves, so probably carrying too much weight with all that paper and binoculars and things, that just the amount of pressure on my feet. It's not a problem, they just feel a bit tingly, and it still hasn't really come right. And how long is that? It's 5 months ago now.
I quite by coincidence, I've been to you and Gordon on the edge of the Manawatu River in Palmerston North, but did you meet any other Birds New Zealand members along the way?
I did actually, and I was going to squeeze that in, but the talk was way too long anyway. But yeah, Matu Booth doing 5-minute bird counts in the Dome Forest, and Corey and Watts biking beside the Waikato River. And then I mentioned Kevin Collier, my classmate. There were only 14 of us did 4th year zoology, but we shared 5 huts and 1 campsite in south of Wanaka. So yeah, and there were a few other places where I met people who I knew in the huts. To the point that Gordon would occasionally say, "Isn't it time we met someone you knew?" Which was probably a reflection that my interests get out into the back doors, whereas he's a laboratory chemist, and so maybe he didn't know quite so many trends. Oh, we've possibly got a comment from Peter Frost. So, Peter, you're welcome to. You got your hand
Kia ora.
up.
Hi, Colin. I was going to ask you what
Speakers
can you hear me?
Excuse me, I managed to mute myself.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah. No, that's fine. Good. I was going to ask you, what was the one thing that most surprised you? But you've given us quite a few. So I was then going to comment on your chat GPT. You may want to revise that, because if you type in why are some New Zealand fantails black, it tells you that it's a genetic mutation. It gives you about 1% of the fantail population exhibiting black coloration, and it goes on for another 3 paragraphs.
Well, that's good to know, but my comment was I think they took a very specific phrase, and I don't know what they used, but somehow
that's true. Yep.
Morph got edited into turn, and that was when the penny dropped with me, that in CGI and common, popular culture, morph means to change. And it makes me think we need to come up with another word. We've got rid of phase, and now we need to get rid of morph. We need something that is immutable. So there's a challenge. We will come up with a phrase that means a plumage state that never changes, and the people's attitudes to it never change. So yeah. So thank you, Peter. Yeah, I'm glad someone knows how to use these tools, because I have no idea.
Yes, maybe you told and I didn't understand, but you have a predetermined white band where inside you count, or you count as long as you can see or hear in both sides.
I use what I would call unbounded counts. So pretty much, if I could see it or hear it, I would count it. By and large, it was what I could see and hear unaided. So I did have a pair of binoculars. I would usually only use them to check identity, but just occasionally when I get to a lake or an estuary, I would use them. And particularly when I got to the Ambury Farm Park, which is a major waderlist on Manukau Harbour, I actually arranged ahead for 2 friends to meet us there with the telescope. So we were actually looking for rare waders. We're specifically looking for grey-tailed tattler and wimble. We dipped on the wimble, but we got the grey-tailed tattler. But there's no way I would have got those with my dirty little pair of binoculars. So yeah, by and large, it was unaided.
So you cannot told the data or put your data in an area.
No, I was not trying to work out bird density. It was pretty much an index. What would someone who was reasonably knowledgeable about birds see or hear if they walked this trail? So it's not, I'm not trying to turn it into birds per hectare or anything.
Thank you.
Okay, Don, you got a comment?
I didn't follow all of the blogs, so I'm not sure if you mentioned this on it or not, but where do you see the chestnut-breasted shelduck you mentioned?
Where?
Yes.
It was near the Waikato River, but it was specifically near the race course there, south of Mary, or near Mary, what's that called? Something down, Hampton Downs.
Hampton Downs.
Because there was all this roar of V8s for hours as we walked along the river, and that was still going on while we were looking at those shelducks. But they were inland, they were further away from the river, and they flew further, and there was quite a lot of the trail where it's quite specific. You stay on the trail, you don't leave the trail. So they were probably 100 meters away. But what was happening was there's about 36 shelducks in a flock, and I was counting them. And near the end of my binocular stand, it was just stuck out, very obvious. And I handed the binoculars to Gordon, and he said, "Is it the one that's more brightly coloured?" So even though he wasn't a bird, he knew paradise shelduck, but he knew that was the one I was interested in. So yeah, it's
more than one, or
that was just one. Male. It's a species that reaches New Zealand at the moment most years, so it's not hugely rare, but still very cool. And particularly if you're walking the day after day and seeing nothing different, it's quite a buzz to find something unexpected. Whereas some of those other rarities, I knew that there was a wandering tattler at Ocean Beach, and if I got to the right spot with the right, in that case, Kathy Mitchell, who we were staying with that night, knew where it would be and given me very specific advice. And similarly, the Little Egret is often on Manukau Harbour. I've seen one there before. If there's anywhere in the country you're likely to see Little Egret, Manukau Harbour is it. And similarly to the Fairy Tern, there's a pair there in Araroa Beach. We knew they'd be there. They're very rare. Still very cool to see, but not unexpected at those locations. Julia.
Did you see many kia or hear many kia?
Not many here at all, actually. We heard them at a couple of sites and we met other walkers who had them, for example, at Crooked Spur Hut in the Two Thumb Range where we stopped for lunch. We didn't have them there, but the only place we actually saw them was at Goat Pass Hut. And pretty much during the hours of darkness, you know, some turned up at dusk, and I don't know if they stayed all night, but they were certainly there pre-dawn. But there were 5 of them at Goat Pass Hut, which is where the coast to coast track goes over the Minga Deception Saddle. But you heard one in Nelson Lake, so they're now very rare. So that was in the Upper Travers Valley, and then just a few near those sites I just mentioned. We heard them when we were near Feely. So coming down the Minga, we heard a few, yeah, but not common. But then the trail for the most part is east of their range, and I suspect if you were able to walk the trail in winter, you'd probably get a few more that have been pushed off the higher areas.
Colin, did you come across kiwi at all?
Yep, I didn't see any. There are a few places where the terrain was suitable where I'd go looking at night, but we heard them at a couple of sites in Northland, and we camped beside a stream on the 42 Traverse, so that's east, well, kind of north of Ruapehu, near the Whakapapa. So, and that's in the area where there's been 1080 operations to benefit kiwi, and it was the first place that really showed that kiwi are better off with 1080, so we heard them there. A couple of sites where I mentioned we were walking beside the Whanganui River, so Whakakoka and Whangarua tracks, we heard them there. And then I think the only place I did was in the South Island was at, it's called Kiwi Hut on the Taranaka River, so that's great spot for kiwi. But I also saw evidence of kiwi at several sites, so droppings, feathers, probe holes. Though all those bloody netting holes, it's getting harder and harder to pick a kiwi probe hole, and people are stabbing them over all the time with sticks. So that's another good reason for birds not to use them, as long as you all don't use them.
And another question on the chat about how long it took you to plan this.
So a question, how long did it take to plan? Well, I probably wasn't serious about it until after Rokiura. So I already had plans for the following summer, so that was part of why. But the timing of it, you know, I sort of knew that the very last opportunity was going to be the 2324 summer, because the Atlas stopped in May this year. You could do this at any time, but if I was going to go to that amount of effort, I sort of wanted the data to contribute to the Atlas scheme. And to be honest, I was pretty surprised that the Atlas had run for 5 years, and the only person who had done this was a late career scientist who had way too many other things on his plate. You know, why aren't all those fit young people who have recently graduated as a university got Colin hands out there?
We've got jobs to find.
Maybe. But yeah, I was kind of thinking, oh, that'd be a cool thing to do. I wonder whether anyone else. And when I shared the information with a few people, there was lots of people saying, I'd love to do it, but I've got to give me hip or whatever. But there was one person who I think was genuine, who would love to do it, and that was Nicky MacArthur. You know, he does this kind of thing all the time along coastlines and rivers. But he's got, I'm guessing, 3-year-old young child, so it might be a while before Nicky repeats this. But yeah, he was someone who really said, you bastard, I want to do that. I think he was genuine.
Have you looked and seen if anyone's done any of this for the Appalachian Trail, Long Trail, Pacific Crest, etc.?
Good question. Yeah, so lots of multi-day trails in other parts of the world. I've looked, and
I haven't found any.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I did the Long Trail and I wanted to do this, so this is really exciting.
No, cool.
But I haven't found anyone else. So.
No, I've done a bit of Googling, but I'm not sure if I'm asking the right question or no one is quite crazy enough. But mentioning that, like, there was a couple who we got to know quite well from France and Belgium, who they finished a few weeks after us, and they went straight from New Zealand to California. And last I heard about a week ago, they are still walking the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a 5,000-kilometre trail. So they'd gone straight from Te Araroa. So by the time I finished that, they'd probably been walking for 8 months and done about 8,000 kilometres. But Antoine, I overheard him at one point that there are only one kind of bird and only one kind of tree. And I had to remind him there are actually two kinds of birds. There are weka and not weka, because they are the couple who had the weka get into their tent and crap everywhere. So if you read the Cook Strikers to Havelock blog, there's an incident there quoting Baldrick and the amount of custard you can get out of a small cat. And if you don't know what that reference is, there is a hyperlink where you can see that quote from the Blackadder Goes Forward. Right, Chocolate Stone,
Thank you very much.
we'll let you escape. Thank you. Thank you for your audience tonight. Still something you've got to do. We've got a thing I can log off. Shows over folks, nothing to see here.
How many did you get through? Not with that, yes.
On average, it's one packet per box. But there was one where I miscalculated the money. Have used up all my supply. I went to hold two. And I was actually right at the end of one about the psychological, not physiological. I didn't check the dates for anything. But you notice my product list. I'm not clear what.
Yes, yes, there are.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, but I had it to some of the other actually finally that I. Yeah, so I really actually runs the bookshop up to the world.
Yeah. What's your number?
C'est bon.
Yeah, we can have a drink sometime. And
Yeah. Yeah.
will you send your podcast?
Yeah, I can send you the notes. So that'd be fun. What do you,
What is the subject specifically of a podcast?
open source, it's
Yeah,
technical.
but sure,
It's
I
technical.
mean,
Don't listen, it's fine. It's on, yeah, it's a different topic entirely.
Did you just came here or where did you just appear to?
Yeah, I moved here 2 months ago. So, yeah, so, yeah, it's exciting. Well, I started my PhD yesterday and today was a holiday in my country, so I took the day off. So it's going pretty good. Besides that, yeah, besides that, I've house, I have a car. Settled in pretty well. I lived in Scotland for 5 years.
Oh, nice.
And then, yeah, are you French? Oh, Swiss. Sorry. But you're Franco. Yeah, no, I lived in Geneva for 3 months.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry.
I'm checking it.
And so, yeah. Yeah, there's a certain amount of physical experience and what you want is, when you're going, I like it. So you weren't going to choose not to, or everything's for it.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Ian.
Do you want to check now or?
Yeah, I'm
not
not-
tomorrow.
Oh, yeah, just briefly, I suppose.
Sorry, if we're gonna talk money, I'm just gonna make sure that you are used as well.